I started something that was only meant to be a fleeting thrill, and now it's turned into one of my biggest regrets. Have you ever been in a situation like this? How did you handle the aftermath? I've made a huge mistake, and it's consuming me, but I don't know how to move forward. My husband, who is 45, and I, 40, have been married for 7 years and have a 5-year-old son together. We were introduced by a mutual friend who thought we'd hit it off. At first, we were just enjoying each other's company, not looking for anything serious. But as time went on, we realized we had a deep connection and decided to become exclusive. 2 years into our relationship, we got married. He's a software engineer at Google, and I work in sales at an insurance company. Everything in our family life was going well, until I made a grave error. About 5 months ago, my husband got a promotion at work, which meant he had to work longer hours. He came home tired every day, and our intimate moments became rare. Each time I tried to initiate something, he would dismiss me, saying he was too tired or giving some other reason. This started to really bother me, and to distract myself, I focused more on my job. One of my clients, Jay, a 48-year-old owner of a small fintech company, became a key part of my work. It was vital for my career to get his company's corporate health insurance contract with our firm, especially given the competitive insurance market. My boss told me to do whatever it took to win Jay's business and suggested I be more friendly than formal with him to build trust. So I started to be more relaxed and informal around Jay. I tried not to let my husband's distant behavior get to me, but it wasn't easy. The same pattern continued, and eventually I confronted him, asking if he was no longer attracted to me or if there was someone else. He assured me that wasn't the case and said his work stress was to blame. I believed him and stopped trying to initiate anything in the bedroom. With my son away at summer camp and my husband emotionally distant, I focused heavily on my job. The house felt lonely when I got back from work, a sharp contrast to earlier times of passion and closeness. Our communication had dwindled and we rarely shared intimate moments. Meanwhile, my interactions with Jay were progressing well. He was engaging and good-looking. My job in corporate health insurance involved numerous discussions about procedures and formalities, often over meals with clients like Jay. I tried to strike the right balance between being professional and friendly, but it was challenging. Jay's comments during our meetings sometimes bordered on flirtatious, though he was subtle. I typically brushed these off, assuming he was just being friendly since he was single. During one lunch, I accidentally spilled water on myself and noticed Jay's gaze lingering where it shouldn't. I quickly redirected our talk back to work matters. I knew it wasn't appropriate, but a part of me relished the attention he paid me, a contrast to the neglect I felt at home. My husband's continuous disinterest had left me feeling unwanted and had eroded my self-confidence. Despite my awareness that it was wrong, I found myself appreciating the attention from another man, something I had been missing in my marriage. Through our work, Jay and I developed a friendly rapport. He started asking me out for meals that weren't related to work, and I enjoyed these breaks from the tension at home. I was drawn to Jay, but I hadn't intended for anything more to happen. At home, my husband was mostly secluded in his office, and by the time he got home, I would have finished dinner alone. Our home felt more like a temporary stay for him than a family space. Since I had stopped trying to initiate romance, he didn't either, and it was apparent he wasn't going to make the first move. Looking back, I recognized that I shouldn't have allowed things to escalate with Jay. During one of our lunches, I found myself flirting with him, craving the attention and affection I wasn't getting from my husband. That evening, I did something completely out of character. I went home with Jay. My frustration and feelings of neglect led me to cross a line I had never imagined crossing. I left his place in the middle of the night, feeling confused and unsure. As I got into my car, I noticed I had missed calls from my husband. I hoped he'd be asleep by the time I got back, so that I wouldn't have to explain where I had been. Luckily, he was asleep when I got home, so I silently went to shower. The next morning, he asked about my whereabouts the night before, and I lied, claiming I had a late work meeting. My husband hardly responded to my explanation and simply continued eating his breakfast. I felt guilty about lying, but his lack of interest in me was still painful. It was then that I resolved not to see Jay anymore. As the contract with his company was almost over, I wouldn't need to meet with him much longer. I convinced myself that my indiscretion was a one-time mistake, reminding myself of my responsibilities to my husband and son. Determined to move past this, I threw myself into work, trying to ignore the emotional impact of my husband's aloofness. I ended up spending most evenings at the office, knowing that the warmth and anticipation that used to greet me at home were no longer there. My son was away at camp for another month, and attempts to connect with my husband during the week were met with his preoccupation and lack of engagement. He seemed content with his own activities, at least. Jay didn't reach out to me after our night together, which I had somewhat anticipated. Despite telling myself it was just a one-off incident, I was surprised by his complete lack of communication. Then, unexpectedly, on a Friday as I was leaving the office, I found Jay waiting for me. He approached and hugged me, saying he had missed me. I was taken aback by his sudden appearance and affection, unsure of how to respond. I told Jay that what happened between us was a mistake and couldn't happen again. He looked hurt by my words and clung to me, arguing that it wasn't a mistake and insisting on the undeniable attraction between us. His words made me falter in my resolve that it was just a one-time thing. Overcome by the moment, I kissed him again. We found ourselves getting intimate in his car in the parking lot, an entirely new and exhilarating experience for me. I promised to call him later before driving home. Once home, I went straight to the shower. When my husband returned and went to sleep without even a kiss, I made up my mind to see Jay again. I knew my actions were selfish and wrong, but with Jay, I didn't feel neglected. Even though I was aware of the potential consequences, a part of me wanted to ignore them. That's how my affair with Jay started. Jay knew about my husband and son and was surprisingly fine with our situation. I emphasized the need for discretion and to avoid being seen together. He suggested we could meet up as colleagues or friends, like we had before, and I agreed. Things seemed to go smoothly. My husband barely asked questions, so I didn't have to lie much. He noticed my late returns and occasional unreachability, but my vague replies were enough for him. He never probed further. The fact that my husband wasn't suspicious brought mixed feelings. On one hand, it was a relief, but on the other, it was disheartening because his lack of suspicion seemed to come from indifference rather than trust. Jay and I would meet at his place or he'd pick me up after work when he could. We shared lunches and dinners, and sometimes we were intimate in his car or in elevators without cameras. The thrill of being with someone in such secretive public spaces was exhilarating, a kind of excitement I hadn't found in my marriage. This affair with a client was more thrilling than I ever imagined. The adrenaline rush from our clandestine meetings added a new dimension to my life. With Jay, I was rediscovering a sense of adventure and excitement that was missing from my relationship with my husband. Despite the excitement, I recognized that I was settling for something that wasn't ideal, but I found enjoyment in it nonetheless. After 2 months, my son returned from summer camp, and I had to readjust my schedule to accommodate his routine. This meant initially spending less time with Jay, but I managed to rearrange things so we could continue seeing each other. My affair with Jay didn't have a clear direction. I was navigating it without a specific plan. When I expressed my uncertainty to Jay, he comforted me by suggesting we just take things one day at a time without thinking too far ahead. His reassurance was a comfort I hadn't received from my husband, who was often preoccupied with work. However, it wasn't just his recent promotion that led to this situation. Even before that, he had always been focused on his job, leaving me to handle most of our home and parenting responsibilities alone. His promotion only intensified these dynamics. He used to carve out time for me on weekends or after dinner, but that had stopped. Once I began my affair with Jay, my husband's lack of attention became less bothersome. With Jay, I found the attention and affection I craved, both emotionally and physically. As time passed, I became increasingly indifferent to my husband's behavior, recognizing that he wasn't truly invested in me. I had been in denial earlier, but now it was glaringly obvious. He never tried to be intimate with me, which, although I no longer wanted it from him, highlighted his lack of interest. The thought of ending our marriage crossed my mind, but I pushed it aside for our son's sake. Despite his failings as a partner, my husband was an attentive father. He made sure our son had everything, including quality time with him. His rare breaks from work were always dedicated to our son, complicating the idea of separating our child from his dad. I couldn't imagine being apart from my son either, so the idea of joint custody was unbearable, with the thought of him shuttling between two homes. I decided to stay in the marriage primarily for our son. My feelings for my husband were fading fast, but my love for my child was what kept me there. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. My career was on the rise, my affair with Jay was fulfilling, and home life was stable, considering the situation. My husband remained deeply engrossed in his work, seemingly oblivious to my presence. I doubt he would have noticed if I had disappeared from his life altogether. To balance my time, I started having lunch with Jay, allowing me to go straight home after work to be with my son. Jay was very understanding of my circumstances, accommodating our meetings to suit my schedule. His empathy and flexibility were remarkable. I thought everything was under control and going as planned, but I couldn't have been more mistaken. Soon, things took a sudden and dramatic turn, changing everything unexpectedly. On the day everything changed, I was on my way to meet Jay for lunch when my phone fell down the stairs. I decided to get it fixed later as I didn't want to delay seeing Jay. He suggested we go to his place, and since it was Friday, I thought it would be fine to leave work early. So, I went with him. I got home around my usual time, 6 in the evening, but to my shock, my son wasn't there. Instead, I found Beth, our nanny, who we hired to look after him after school until my husband or I got home. Beth told me that my son had a high fever at school and had been taken to the hospital. His teacher had tried to call me several times but couldn't get through. Eventually, my husband got the call and went to the hospital. I was in a panic and immediately headed there. My broken phone was the reason I missed the calls. When I got to the hospital, I saw my husband comforting our son, who was now feeling better and telling stories about school. I joined them, but my husband didn't ask any questions about where I had been. The doctor came to see us and let us know that our son had caught the flu but was now well enough to be discharged. I drove our son home, while my husband said he had to return to his office, having left abruptly to be with our son at the hospital. Once home, I fed our son and tucked him into bed, making a mental note to get my phone fixed the next day. That night, I decided to sleep in my son's room. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to find my husband standing at the doorway, looking at me. I was startled at first, but then I recognized him and felt relieved. I noticed he was still in his work clothes and asked him when he had gotten back. He said he had just arrived and wanted to check on our son before heading to bed. I simply nodded in response. When my husband asked about where I was during the teacher's call, I told him about my broken phone and how that prevented them from reaching me. He seemed doubtful and pointed to my damaged phone on the shelf, indicating he knew I hadn't been at work. He said he had called my office, where they informed him I had left for lunch and never came back. His call to my office wasn't unexpected, but with my focus on my son, I hadn't thought about how to explain my absence. I quickly said I had been in a late meeting, but his face didn't give away whether he believed me or not. I just hoped he did, and continued caring for our son. The next day I decided to stay home with my son and also needed to address my phone issue. While Beth cared for my son, I went out to buy a new phone as fixing the old one would take too long. My first call on the new phone was to Jay, where I explained everything. He was as supportive and understanding as always. After his initial questioning, my husband didn't bring up the topic of my whereabouts again. The following days passed without major incidents. My son got better and returned to school, and our home life seemed to resume its usual routine. Returning to my regular office routine, I continued to meet Jay during lunch breaks. But one Friday, to my surprise, I found my husband at home before me, something that hadn't happened in a long time. I greeted him cheerfully and was about to take a shower when he stopped me to ask about my lunch break activities. I was puzzled about how he knew I had been out,